A few months ago, I sat down with Matthew Slater, 3-time Super Bowl champion, 10-time Pro Bowler, one of the most decorated special teams players in the history of the NFL. I asked some questions to figure out one thing. What made him different? And it made me realize something we rarely question about performance. In performance, we already know that talent matters. And we already know that environment matters. Talent being the abilities you're born with, and environment where you grow up. But when you speak to high performers who have had success for a long time, you start to notice something else. Something beyond talent. Something beyond environment. And that's what I went looking for. Under the guidance of Shira Springer, an award-winning storyteller and professor at MIT Sloan, I spoke to Olympians, elite coaches, professional athletes, a world champion, and standouts from the military. I wanted to understand what contributed to their success. What else besides talent and environment? I asked all of them the same questions, and 3 factors kept coming up unprompted across every interview, every domain, and every culture. When I spoke to Matthew Slater, he didn't talk about talent. He talked about his father, high school, draft preparation, leadership, and every phase of a career that spanned 16 years. And through every story, every season, and every example, he kept coming back to one word. Not once, not twice, but 27 times in a single interview. Process. He told me that outcomes drive hiring, firing, and who gets paid what. But you spend 95% of your time in life, regardless of what you're doing, in the process. It's not sexy, it's not celebrated, it's not glamorous, but that's where you live. And that's the first factor, process orientation. Slater couldn't control the talent, the speed that he was born with. And he couldn't control the family he came from or the era that he played in. But his process, his preparation, his focus, his daily habits, that was entirely his. Every high performer I spoke with talked about process, because when your main focus is your process, your outcomes change their meaning. They stop being verdicts, and instead they become signals. It's not you failed, but here's what my process needs to adjust. And that's the difference between performers who can sustain excellence over long periods of time and those who don't. I want you to think about what's in front of you right now. A dissertation, a clinical trial, maybe a startup that's 6 months from a breakthrough or a shutdown. In every one of those situations, the outcome is slow, unpredictable, and largely outside your control. But your process that you can work on today, that is entirely yours. It is that focus on process that was so integral to the success of the high performers I spoke to, along with the second factor, external validation. And I'd like you to meet someone while we talk about this second factor. Kaylee Kneck, an Olympic medalist and assistant captain for the Swiss national ice hockey team. Here's what surprised me about my conversation with Kaylee. When I asked Kaylee about her journey to the Olympics, she didn't talk about hockey. She started with soccer. Because when Kaylee was 12 years old, she was selected for an elite competitive team and was playing in high-level tournaments with national scouts in the stands. And something about that experience, about being chosen, about being told you're good enough to be here, became validating. It's something she carried into her hockey career, and something that she's still carrying now. And she's not alone. Matthew Slater was the second fastest high school sprinter in the state of California. He took that fact with him to every single football game for more than 15 years. No matter who lined up across from him, he knew, I can keep up with anyone on this field. And then there's Thierry Linkou. Linkou was a world #1 in squash and world champion who was top 10 for a decade. He was one of the most process-disciplined athletes that I've ever spoken to. He told me about a moment from when he was a child, a PE class, where he picked up a discus and he literally threw it out of the stadium. The teacher stared, the other kids stared, and Thierry felt something click. Not arrogance, not certainty, but evidence. A piece of permanent evidence that he was capable of something extraordinary. And 20 years after he was number one in the world, he could recall that moment in PE class when he did something special. He went back to that discus, to that stadium, to that moment. What I found speaking to performer after performer is that they all have a moment like this. A moment when someone or something told them, you belong here. You can do this. External validation doesn't just build confidence. It creates a reference point, something to point to when you're under pressure or the competition heats up. So let me ask you something. Can you think of a discus out of the stadium moment? A moment when someone saw something in you? A reviewer, a teacher, a supervisor, a result, maybe an admission letter that told you that you were special. When did you last go back to it? It might be time to revisit. But there's a third thing that came up in every conversation, something else that wasn't talent, wasn't environment, but something that is absolutely critical to long-term success. And that is identity beyond your craft. At the end of every single interview I did, I asked the same question. What is your greatest achievement? Think about who I was asking. An Olympic medalist, military standout, Super Bowl and world champions. Not one person mentioned the pinnacle accomplishment of their career. Not one medal, not one ranking, not one championship. They talked about family, about being a good teammate, about the younger athlete they'd helped or the person that they'd become. Matthew Slater cut right to the heart of it. Who you are is not dictated by what you do professionally. To further make my point, I'd like to introduce you to Emma White, an Olympic medalist in cycling. After her first Olympic Games, she walked away from the sport. Not because she failed, not because she wasn't capable. She left because her identity had always been bigger than the competition. And here's the counterintuitive part. That is exactly what made her great. When results were poor or the data wasn't there, she didn't spiral. There was more to her than the result. Emma wasn't just a cyclist. She was a high performer practicing her craft. And when that chapter ended, she exited with confidence and grace. Today, she's a software engineer, leaning fully into a different part of who she is. Not because cycling failed her, but because it was one expression of her excellence, not the source of her identity. I do want to say something directly to you. I've been in some elite environments, and I've been very fortunate to speak to some remarkable people. But in my experience, there is no community in the world that ties its identity more closely to its work than this one, meaning the MIT community. The performers who sustain excellence aren't the ones who care less about their work. They're the ones who are not wholly defined by it. Identity outside your craft, outside your sport, outside your result is not a retreat from ambition. It is exactly what makes sustained ambition possible. The question for this room is not whether you care enough. It's whether you've built something you can come back to when the results aren't there. Like I mentioned throughout this conversation, talent and environment are incredibly important to performance. And if you try to write down how performance works in an equation, it might look something like this. We know that talent matters, we know environment matters, and there's actually substantial research that talent and environment interact and amplify each other. But every model has a constant. And in this case, that's the contribution to performance that's not talent. It's not environment. What I've been trying to do These conversations that have been trying to do is understand what's inside alpha. My theory, and I want to be clear that this is a theory and not a proof, is that the three things I've described today are part of what's in that constant. Process orientation, external validation, identity beyond your craft. You can't control the talent you're born with. You can't control the era, your family, whether a national scout was in the stands on your best day. But you can control your process. You can seek the moments that tell you what you're capable of. And you can build an identity large enough to survive the periods of time when the results don't come. The performers I spoke with didn't just have more talent than most. They had better alphas. So the question is, what's in yours?